The following presentation, titled Faded Red, is meant only for historical commentary and offers possible explanations to alleged events, but not necessarily the only ones. Faded Red contains copyright footage from NASA, the History Channel, UFO TV, Jones Entertainment Group, and uncopyrighted footage from various users on YouTube. Additional photography and music is credited at the end of this presentation. The views expressed in Faded Red may not represent the views of the copyright owner or the sources of uncopyrighted footage, as well as any scholar mentioned in this video. The copyright owners do not support or endorse the views in Faded Red. Winston Churchill described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Yet whatever mystery Russia was under the rule of the Tsars, the Soviet Union amplified this mysterious enigma in a shroud of the highest secrecy. However, Russian society was radically different in the Soviet Union than its predecessor. For the first time, the Russian people were optimistic about the future. For the first time, the Russian people truly believed they were a superpower and had high hopes for the future. They had dreams of a crusade against capitalism and the establishment of a communist utopia. Marxist-Leninist philosophy mandated that the Soviet society should pride itself on technological triumphs and scientific achievements. And, to an extent, it did. A Russian schoolmaster, Konstantin Tsistovodsky, is the father of modern rocketry. It was he who figured out how to send machines and even men into space. The use of liquid fuel propellants, combustion chambers, and staging. He even figured out the speed and altitude an object would need to go into orbit, or even escape velocity into deep space. Since the father of modern rocketry was a Russian, and later a Soviet hero, the Russian people believed it was their destiny to lead humanity into the final frontier. Enthusiasm and support for space exploration spread, and a Soviet space culture was born. To fulfill their dreams, they looked to the Soviet regime to lead the way. When he was in power, Joseph Stalin turned a deaf ear on this space culture. Yet when Khrushchev came to power, he was determined to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union. With the idea of utopia rooted in scientific accomplishments, Khrushchev began to appeal to the Soviet space culture. Khrushchev knew that he could win the hearts and minds of the Russian people should he deliver on their dreams of spaceflight and win their faith and trust in the Soviet regime. And so the Soviet space program became more than just an instrument to compete with the United States over ideals, but also an instrument of the Soviet regime to win the loyalty of the Russian people, and one that had to work. Success meant people's loyalty to the Soviet regime, and failure meant public distrust in the Soviet regime and the potential to undermine its authority. And sure enough, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the new Soviet space program shocked the world with groundbreaking achievements and triumphs in space exploration. The first satellite, the first man in space, the first woman in space, the first full-day flight, the first dual flights, the first multi-man flight, and the first spacewalk. These pioneers were unknown to the world, including the Russian people, until they had been to space. Then they became national heroes in the Soviet Union, where they made their dreams of spaceflight come true. Yet they had no idea how secretive the Soviet space program was and the failures it concealed. anything about the Soviet space program that would tarnish its image remained closely guarded secrets. One such example was cosmonaut Grigory Neyubov, who was expelled from the cosmonaut program after a drunken brawl, and Soviet officials saw to it that he never had anything to do with their space program. Take the famous Sochi 6 picture, for example. Now you see him, now you don't. He had been airbrushed from the photograph. It was a method of censorship that was commonplace by paranoid Soviet officials, so the Soviet regime could literally rewrite history. The Soviet space program's chief designer, Sergei Korolev, was not immune to the secrecy of the Soviet space program. Despite the fact that he was responsible for the program's triumphs, he remained an unknown figure to the Russian people, and therefore the rest of the world. Not even his name was disclosed. He had also been cheated out of not one but two Nobel Prizes for Sputnik 1 and Vostok 1, the first manned space flight. This was done to protect him from potential assassination by American CIA agents. Only after his death in 1966 did the Soviets give him a state funeral and allow the world to know Korolev's name. Many failed rocket testing and training exercises were kept secret, including the death of Valentin Bondarenko in a low-pressure altitude chamber in 1961. The Soviets were even successful in keeping the worst space tragedy secret for decades. In October 1960, Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin supervised the test of a prototype R-16 rocket. Then, a premature ignition of the rocket's second stage caused an explosion, killing all within its path, including Nedelin. Since many of those killed didn't even leave their bodies behind to bury, the actual number of casualties is still debated among historians, although it is very likely to be in the hundreds. Since accidents and tragedies like these have been revealed to the world, some historians are quick to judge that all Soviet space tragedies have been revealed and that there is nothing left to hide. Yet despite such unwarranted trust in the Russian Federation, the successor to the Soviet Union, there are still many things about the Russian space program that are still classified and have yet to be revealed to the world. Historian Asif A. Siddiqui of Fordham University has investigated the secrecy of the Soviet space program. He has been able to dig deeper into the Kremlin archives than countless others have been able to do. And despite the fact that the Soviet space program was notoriously secretive, Siddiqui found out that the Soviet space program was even more secretive than most others had thought. Siddiqui's works mention that the true, yet secretive launch facilities of the Soviet space program were not from the town of Baikonur as the Soviets had originally claimed, but rather from the remote Tyuratam launch site. This would later be renamed the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Siddiqui also revealed the secrecy in how the Soviets built their Vostok spacecraft. When workers made the parts to the spacecraft, they did not know what they were for. Only those few engineers who completed the final assembly knew. Yet Siddiqui also discovered that the footage of the Vostok cosmonauts climbing into their spacecraft before their spaceflight, with state officials there to wish them bon voyage, was staged. No, the missions weren't staged, just the pre-flight buildup. What you are seeing in this footage is Yuri Gagarin reenacting his pre-flight festivities after he had completed his spaceflight, so the Soviets would have something to show the world. Therefore, there will be little to no evidence of any Vostok flight should it end in failure. With so much precaution taken to shroud potential failed missions, it seemed as though nobody could discover any manned spaceflight tragedy the Soviets could experience. Yet, as history has shown time and time again, many things can still slip through the smallest of cracks. One such crack was an old World War II bunker in Italy, Torre Verte, which was turned into a radio station by two brothers, Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia, who were not only amateur radio operators, but also space enthusiast. When the Soviets published the radio frequencies of Sputnik 1, the brothers tuned in and recorded the transmission on magnetic tape. Achille, also being a medical student, was able to provide the equipment necessary to allow him and his brother to record the telemetric data that was the heartbeat of the first terrestrial being in space, a dog named Laika. Despite the fact that the Soviets never announced a Vostok flight till after its success, the brothers managed to record Yuri Gagarin's historic flight. When the Americans were preparing to send astronaut John Glenn for their first orbital flight, they kept their radio frequencies classified for fear of Soviet espionage.
Engine start. May the we with be with you, Thomas. Good Lord, ride all the way. Give Godspeed, John Glenn. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
Despite this setback, the Cordiglia brothers proved their skill and potential by figuring out the length of the antenna of the Mercury spacecraft and therefore its radio frequencies, therefore allowing them to record John Glenn's historic flight.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around.
The claims of the Cordiglia brothers recording these spaceflights have been mostly undisputed. Yet for some strange reason, a few of them have been disputed, and in some cases dismissed as hoaxes. One such example was a recording made on November 28, 1960. After the brothers got the news from a German tracking station that was picking up unusual transmissions from a Soviet space frequency, the brothers tuned in. After an hour of static, a Morse code signal for SOS emerged. By triangulating the radio signal and factoring in the Doppler effect, the brothers were able to track the object that was making this transmission. To their surprise, it was slowly moving away from Earth. The brothers claimed that they had heard a manned spaceflight. The claim by the brothers that this was a manned spaceflight was largely dismissed, and critics today are quick to point out that the supposed Vostok flight could never have achieved the escape velocity needed to break free of the Earth's gravity. Which is true. But what else do we know that could have made this a manned Vostok spaceflight? A Vostok spacecraft has two modules, an instrument module and a descent module. The instrument module has a retro rocket to slow the craft down, allowing it to descend back to Earth. It is then jettisoned from the descent module, which contains the cockpit and the heating protection for re-entry. But what would happen if this rocket was pointed in the wrong direction? A Vostok spacecraft was not flown by the Cosmonaut, but rather by automation. In other words, in Soviet Russia, spacecraft flies you. A pitchover maneuver was needed to align the craft for re-entry, using a special viewer instrument, VSAR. It would then use the Sun and the Earth's horizon to align the craft in the proper orientation for re-entry. Yet, if that largely untested sensor failed, it would be easy for the rocket to be pointed in the wrong direction, and firing the engine would speed up the spacecraft. Extra speed would cause the craft to raise its altitude dramatically. A rise in altitude would make it look as though it was moving away from the Earth to the Cordiglia brothers. But after it would pass out of radio range, it would slow down. Since the spacecraft cannot achieve escape velocity, the speed would eventually be slow enough to the point where it would be pulled back to the Earth by its gravity and speed up, and go around the Earth again. This is called an elliptical orbit. And while it is possible for a Vostok spacecraft to go into an elliptical orbit, the Cordiglia brothers would never have tracked it coming back to Earth, because it would have been out of radio range. It is also possible that this alleged lost cosmonaut could have survived. Whatever scant remains of fuel the spacecraft had left could have been used to realign the spacecraft to re-enter straight from its course. This is how the American Apollo spacecraft re-entered the atmosphere. So with this explanation based on the data available, it is possible that the Cordiglia brothers had tuned in to a manned Vostok flight gone wrong. Yet, it wouldn't be their only claim of a lost cosmonaut. In February 1961, the Cordiglia brothers once again tuned into a Soviet space frequency, and they picked up a radio transmission of labored breathing and the heartbeat by way of telemetric data. The brothers brought the results to their father, who was a cardiologist, and the internationally acclaimed surgeon, Dr. Mario Dogliotti. Both confirmed that it was the sound and heartbeat of a dying man. It's not hard to figure out how a cosmonaut can be marooned in orbit. A premature jettison of the instrument module would do the job well. Not only did the instrument module provide the only engine to bring the cosmonaut back to Earth, it also provided power and life support. Power and life support would only last a few short hours than the descent module alone. Although Vostok orbits would decay, there is no way the cosmonaut can get back until life support ran out. Despite the fact that this simple mishap is very possible, critics still dispute it. This alleged incident is circulating along the internet, and as this example shows, the event has two dates, February 2nd and February 4th. But why two dates? On February 4, 1961, the Soviets launched a probe intended to perform a flyby of Venus. However, the probe failed to leave Earth orbit, and for 2 decades, the Soviets claimed it was not a probe, but a satellite. Critics of the lost cosmonauts claim that this probe is what the Cordiglia brothers heard. But Dr. Dogliotti's report was released in a New York Times article dated, well, February 4th. If this was a probe, this means that the probe had to be launched at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, reached orbit, recorded by the Cordiglia brothers at Torre Bert, present the data to their father and Dr. Dogliotti, send the news across the Atlantic, and somehow make it in time to be released in a New York Times article all on the same day? This could not possibly have been the probe because there is no way the news could get from Torre Bert in time for the New York Times that same day. It had to be recorded on February 2nd. So, why do some people say the 4th? Is it deliberate misdirection by critics who are determined to discredit this recording? Perhaps the most famous recording of the Cordiglia brothers happened a month after Yuri Gagarin's flight. On May 16, 1961, the Cordiglia brothers intercepted a transmission indicating a launch. According to the brothers, the Soviets had launched a female cosmonaut into space for a 17-orbit flight. Yet, something went wrong during the flight, and re-entry had to be postponed. While it is unknown what went wrong during the flight, it's common sense to figure out that it was something that had to make either re-entry or landing too dangerous to attempt, and it had to be a defect that was visibly noticeable to the cosmonaut. Since it would have been too dangerous to land inside the spacecraft, the Vostok cosmonauts had to eject from their craft and parachute separately to safety. Since one of the translated lines in the recording by the Cordiglia brothers was, "Am I going to crash?" something that would prevent ejection is very likely. A visible defect that would prevent ejection could be either a faulty bolt in the hatch, or a defect on the ejection handle, such as a broken cable, all of which were visible to the cosmonaut, especially the ejection handle. On May 23rd, after 7 days of what might have been efforts to come up with a solution, dwindling air supplies forced a re-entry attempt. The Cordiglia brothers tuned in to the Soviet space frequency and recorded this horrifying transmission. 3 days later, the Soviet news agency TASS announced the failed re-entry of a satellite the size of a bus on the 23rd of May. Its launch was never disclosed, and the purpose of the satellite was never mentioned. Critics are quick to dismiss this claim of the Cordiglia brothers as misinterpretation, or even some saying it was a flat-out hoax. Yet their supporting arguments discredit their own critique of the Cordiglia brothers and the lost cosmonauts.
And here's another reason why it's absolutely impossible. The timeline simply was impossible to get another flight in between. Okay, this Ludmila recording happened in May 1961, between Vostok 1 and between Vostok 2. There's no time for a Vostok 1.5. The idea that they could have secretly put together another one of these Vostok R7 boosters, I mean, it's really strains credibility. They simply did not have the resources to put something together.
Oh, really?
The Russians chalk up another victory in the space race as they put two manned spacecraft into orbit within 24 hours of each other. Colonel Pavel Povovich and Major Andriy Nikolaev follow in the footsteps of two other Russian astronauts, Titov and Gagarin, and thus give the Soviets 4 manned orbital flights against 2 for the United States.
Brian Dunning's statement is ripped to shreds with indisputable historical events. How could the Soviets possibly not have been able to launch flights within a month of each other if they were able to launch within a day of each other?
Did you know that their resources were so limited that when German Titov flew, they had to scavenge Yuri Gagarin's spacesuit to make another spacesuit for Titov. They were that strapped on resources. They didn't even have 2 complete spacesuits.
Okay, so if Dunning's remarks are plausible, that means there were 2 cosmonauts in space at the same time. One had a spacesuit, and the other did not.
The Soviets made the most of the flight in their worldwide propaganda and televised pictures of the astronauts from outer space. Naturally, there was jubilation in Russia, and the crowds followed the progress of the new heroes in Red Square. Other troubles were forgotten.
And in this famous picture of Yuri Gagarin on his way out to the launch pad, German Titov, the second cosmonaut in space, as well as Yuri Gagarin's backup, is seen here wearing a second spacesuit. So, why would they need to scavenge Gagarin's spacesuit if Titov already had one the same day Gagarin was flying? Or, if Dunning's remarks are plausible, that's just a cheap Halloween costume. I guess that makes sense if your preemptively chosen conclusion is that there were no lost cosmonauts. So how can there be lost cosmonauts still kept secret when we know of Soviet spaceflight disasters and tragedies? When Leonid Brezhnev came to power, he decided to take a new approach to spaceflight by allowing the Soviet public to tune into spaceflights as they happened. Historian Brian Harvey christened this new approach as Brezhnev's Thaw. The first mission under Brezhnev's Thaw was to be a docking between two of the new Soyuz spacecraft and the first crew transfer EVA. It was the first manned space mission that the Soviets had announced in advance. Fanfare surrounding the two flights grew, as the mission was to take place during the celebration of Lenin's birthday. Little did the public know that the Soyuz 1 spacecraft was badly flawed. On April 24, 1967, cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov launched in Soyuz 1. Upon reaching orbit, a solar panel failed to deploy, the attitude control system was flawed, and by the 13th orbit, the automatic stabilization system was dead. The launch of Soyuz 2 was cancelled, and Komarov had to make an emergency return to Earth. When the parachute failed, Komarov was killed on impact. Despite known cover-up attempts, the Soviets couldn't deny the flight happened, due to the fact that it was the first manned Soviet spaceflight that was publicly disclosed before the flight took place. Another tragedy was in 1971, when 3 cosmonauts aboard Soyuz 11 was launched to the first space station, Salyut 1. For 22 days, Vladislav Volkov, Georgy Dobrovolsky, and Viktor Patsayev were given extensive media coverage as the whole Soviet Union tuned in to watch them live on television. On June 30th, the Soyuz spacecraft made a textbook landing. Little did anyone know was that a pressure valve malfunctioned and depleted the life-sustaining air out of the spacecraft. With no pressure suits, the cosmonauts were killed. Again, the Soviets could not cover up the tragedy due to disclosure before and during the flight. After all, how can you cover up a flight that was on national television? But when they can deny an event, the scale of how the Soviets could cover up tragedies is astonishing. On March 18, 1980, a rocket at the Plesetsk Cosmodrome exploded on the launch pad, killing more than 40 people. Since the Soviets didn't want America to know they were trying to launch a spy satellite, all footage, pictures, and records were destroyed by the Soviets. The only reason we know this tragedy happened was due to the fact that the survivor stories can now be told. This demonstrates the ability of the Soviets to completely erase events from history. If they could do this to the accident at Plesetsk, couldn't they also do it to the lost cosmonauts? As of now, there is no smoking gun evidence that there were lost cosmonauts. But based on further examination of the evidence available, we know it was possible that there were lost cosmonauts. Critics are also faced with the impossible task of disproving the lost cosmonauts due to the fact that historians cannot prove a negative. In their futile attempt to do so, they make claims that contradicts with the history that is already known and proven, which consistently discredits their case. Why do they do so? Are they hiding something? More has yet to be revealed about the Russian space program. As written by Asif A. Siddiqui, I had the great fortune of working in some of these archives over the past few years, and I can tell you that the information they have is just amazing. I have seen with my own eyes, for example, hundreds of pages of documentation on the abandoned UR-700 manned lunar project, which have never been published, even in Russian. There are still things waiting to be discovered. With more information about the Russian space program constantly being discovered, who knows what we'll find next. If the accounts of the events concerning the lost cosmonauts remain plausible, and any documentation claiming there were no lost cosmonauts cannot be trusted, then there are only two possibilities. Either there were no lost cosmonauts, and the theory would forever remain a mystery, or there would only be one way the mystery would be solved, confirming that there were indeed lost cosmonauts.